It was midnight when I arrived at the scene. The rain was relentless, hammering the cobblestones like a drummer gone mad and washing away any hope of outside evidence. A call had come in about an hour ago. A murder at the Wellington Hotel, room 713. A single room, locked from the inside. The perfect puzzle. The Wellington Hotel loomed in the darkness, its elegant facade marred by the flickering glow of the old neon sign. The building had an air of faded grandeur, its once pristine exterior now weathered by decades of rain and neglect. Inside, the lobby was eerily silent except for the soft hum of the chandelier overhead, its crystals shimmering like captured stars. I flashed my badge to the desk clerk, a wiry man with trembling hands who kept glancing nervously at the elevator. He stammered out the floor number as I stepped into the lift. The smell of stale carpet cleaner lingered as the doors closed, the ding of each passing floor echoing in my ears like a countdown. When I stepped into the hallway, the air was thick with tension, a mix of fear and curiosity lingering among the few officers gathered outside the room. The hallway's ornate wallpaper, gold with intricate floral patterns, seemed to close in on me as I approached. The muted light from the wall sconces cast long, wavering shadows that danced with the rhythm of the storm outside. Sergeant Miller greeted me with a grim nod, his usual bravado subdued. "It's a strange one, Detective. Door locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry, and the windows latched. Victim's a middle-aged man, Charles Edgerton. Local businessman. Witnesses?" I asked, stepping past him. "None. Room service says they brought him dinner around 8. No one saw or heard anything after that." "All right," I muttered, pulling on a pair of gloves. "Let's see the scene." The room was a study in quiet opulence. Plush carpets in a deep burgundy hue, mahogany furniture polished to a gleaming finish, and thick velvet drapes that muffled the sound of the storm outside. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its light refracting in subtle rainbows across the walls. The air was heavy with the faint scent of cologne and something metallic, blood. On the bed lay the body of Charles Edgerton, his lifeless eyes staring at the ornate ceiling. A single stab wound to the chest, precise and deliberate, had soaked his tailored shirt in crimson. His face bore a look of frozen surprise, as if death had caught him mid-thought. I scanned the room methodically. The knife was on the floor beside the bed, its handle wiped clean. No fingerprints. The window was indeed latched from the inside, and the room's only door had been locked with the deadbolt engaged. The key rested on the bedside table, positioned as if taunting us with its simplicity. The small table lamp beside it flickered slightly, the bulb struggling against the storm's sporadic power surges. "What's the initial thought?" I asked Miller, who was shifting uneasily by the doorway. "Suicide, maybe?" But he hesitated. "It doesn't make sense. Why wipe the knife?" "Exactly. This wasn't a suicide," I said, crouching beside the body. The man's expression was frozen in a mix of surprise and pain. "And whoever did this wanted us to think it was impossible." I stood and began a detailed sweep of the room. Every corner, every surface. It wasn't long before I noticed the faintest trace of something unusual, a thin wire dangling just above the doorframe, almost imperceptible against the dark wood. I followed it carefully, tracing it back to a small, concealed device tucked behind the curtain rod. A pulley system, expertly crafted and designed for subtlety. "Clever," I muttered to myself, examining the craftsmanship. The device had been rigged to pull the deadbolt closed after the murderer left the room. The wire had been cut, likely by the killer, once the job was done. But how had they exited without using the door or window? I turned my attention to the air vent. It was large enough for a slim person to crawl through. The screws were loose, but there were no visible prints. I grabbed a flashlight and peered inside. About 10 feet in, I saw scuff marks leading to the adjacent room. The narrow confines of the vent bore the telltale streaks of someone dragging themselves through, likely in haste. A faint metallic scraping echoed from deeper within, suggesting something had been dragged along the surface. "Miller," I called, my voice cutting through the thick silence. "I need access to room 715. Minutes later, I was standing in the neighboring suite. It was unoccupied, the bed untouched, its sterile neatness a stark contrast to the chaos of the murder scene. The vent cover was similarly loose, and there were faint muddy prints on the carpet leading to the window. The latch was undone. I opened it and looked out. A maintenance scaffold clung to the side of the building, rain pooling on its wooden planks. The storm had made it slippery, but it was a viable escape route. A stray tool, a wrench, rested on one corner of the platform, its metal gleaming in the dim light from the street below. They used a vent to get into this room and escaped through the scaffold, I explained to Miller. It's a classic misdirection. Lock the door, leave no trace, and hope we'd chalk it up to an impossible crime. But why Edgerton? Miller asked, scratching his head as he followed my gaze to the scaffold. That, I said, pulling a folded paper from the victim's pocket, is the next question. The paper was a contract, one that tied Edgerton to a shady real estate deal. The signature at the bottom belonged to a name I'd encountered before, Victor Lang, a notorious businessman with a penchant for eliminating loose ends. The ink was smudged, as if Edgerton had clutched it tightly in his final moments. The faint imprint of a second signature, hastily scribbled and then erased, was barely visible under the smudges. I examined the room once more, noting small details. The indentation on the carpet where a heavy briefcase might have been placed, the faint ash residue near the desk. Edgerton had likely been reviewing this document when his killer struck. The man had been sitting at the desk, perhaps sipping from the half-empty glass of scotch that now sat forgotten, its amber liquid glinting in the dim light. A single lipstick stain on the rim of a second glass hinted at an unknown guest. Before I could take another step, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. You're looking in the wrong place. My pulse quickened. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew what I'd just uncovered. I glanced back at Miller, then at the crime scene. The message shifted everything. Lang might have been involved, but this wasn't his handiwork. Miller, get someone to watch Lang, I said, heading for the door. I'll be back. Back in the lobby, the wiry desk clerk froze as I approached. He'd been jumpy all night, and my patience had worn thin. You, I said, pointing at him. What aren't you telling me? I don't know what you mean, he stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit. I grabbed his arm, my voice low and sharp. Start talking. His resolve crumbled. All right. I didn't know they were going to kill him, he blurted. I was supposed to distract him while she set it up. She? Who? A woman, he whispered. She wore a red scarf. She said it was just to scare him, to make him back off some deal. I didn't think it'd end like this. Before I could press further, the sound of glass shattering upstairs cut through the lobby like a gunshot. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the stairs, leaving the clerk cowering behind the counter. Miller's voice called after me, but I didn't stop. The sound had come from room 715, the escape route. The stairwell echoed with the pounding of my boots, the rhythmic drumming of rain outside growing louder as I climbed. By the time I reached the door to room 715, it was ajar, swaying slightly as if it had been left in a hurry. Inside, the room was no longer pristine. The vent cover lay on the floor, and the glass window had been smashed outward, shards glittering on the soaked carpet. A figure in dark clothing was perched on the scaffold, struggling to maintain their balance as the storm howled around them. Stop! I shouted, stepping to the window with my gun drawn. The figure froze for a moment, then turned to face me. A woman. Her face was obscured by the rain and shadows, but the red scarf around her neck was unmistakable. She hesitated, her hands gripping the scaffold rail as she seemed to weigh her options. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, she leapt to the adjacent platform, her agility defying the slick, treacherous conditions. I cursed under my breath and climbed out onto the scaffold, the icy rain immediately soaking through my coat. The wind whipped against me as I steadied myself, the height dizzying even for someone used to the city's rooftops. The woman was fast, but desperation had made her reckless. A misplaced step sent her skidding, and she clung to the edge of the scaffold to avoid plummeting. Give it up, I yelled, inching closer. There's nowhere left to run. She glared at me, her face partially visible now. Pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that burned with defiance. You don't know what you're messing with, detective, she spat, her voice barely audible over the storm. This goes way beyond Edgerton. Then why don't you enlighten me? I asked, keeping my gun trained on her. Who sent you? Lang? She smirked, the expression chilling in its calmness. Lang? He's just a pawn. There are bigger players in this game. Before I could respond, she reached into her pocket and tossed something toward me. Instinctively, I stepped back, my grip faltering for a split second. When I looked again, she was gone, the scaffold swaying violently where she'd stood. I rushed to the edge and saw her silhouette disappearing into an alley below, swallowed by the rain and shadows. I looked down at the object she'd thrown. A flash drive, slick with rain, lay on the scaffold floor. I pocketed it and made my way back inside, my mind racing with questions. Back in the room, Miller was waiting, his face a mix of confusion and concern. What the hell happened up there? She got away, I said, holding up the flash drive. But she left us a clue. The drive turned out to be encrypted, of course, but I wasn't new to this game. I called in a favor with the tech team downtown, and within an hour, I had access to its contents. Files upon files of documents, emails, and financial records, all tied to a shadowy organization operating under the radar. Lang's name appeared multiple times, but he was far from the top. The true leaders were hidden, their identities cloaked behind layers of aliases and dummy corporations. One thing was clear, though. Edgerton had been a liability. He'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and they'd silenced him for it. The woman with the red scarf had been right. This was bigger than one murder. This was a web of corruption, and I just brushed the edge of it. As I stared at the screen, the phone buzzed in my pocket again. Another message from the unknown number. Stop now, or you'll be next. I looked out the window at the rain-soaked city below, its lights shimmering like ghostly beacons in the storm. Stopping wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a war, and I intended to win. The warning message only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't about to let a shadowy threat scare me off. The woman with the red scarf was out there, and so was the rest of the truth. With the flash drive files in hand, I started piecing together the puzzle. The documents pointed to a meeting, a secret gathering scheduled for tomorrow night at a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of town. The same warehouse that Edgerton had invested in as part of a failed real estate project. It all clicked. This was where the woman would be. This was where they'd tie up their loose ends. The next evening, the storm had cleared, leaving the city cold and silent. I waited outside the warehouse with Miller and a small team of officers, armed and ready. The plan was simple. Get in, catch the woman, and take down anyone else involved. The warehouse was as grimy and forgotten as I'd expected. Rusted metal siding, broken windows, and an air of abandonment. But inside, it was alive with activity. Voices echoed through the cavernous space, and the faint glow of laptops illuminated a group of figures huddled near the center. At the head of the group stood the woman in the red scarf, giving orders with calm authority. On my mark, I whispered into my radio, signaling the team to move. We crept in from all sides, using the shadows as cover. As I got closer, I caught snippets of their conversation, plans to cover their tracks, bribes to keep officials quiet, and references to Edgerton as a mistake they couldn't afford to repeat. When we were in position, I gave the order. Go! The warehouse erupted into chaos as officers stormed in, shouting commands and waving flashlights. The criminals scattered like cockroaches, but there was nowhere for them to run. Within moments, most of them were subdued, handcuffed, and forced to the ground. The woman, however, made a break for it, heading for the rear exit. Not this time, I muttered, chasing after her. She was fast, but I was faster. I tackled her just as she reached the door, pinning her to the cold concrete. She fought like a cornered animal, but I wasn't about to let her slip away again. Game's over, I growled, snapping cuffs on her wrists. She smirked, even as her chest heaved with exertion. You think catching me will stop this? You've only scratched the surface. Maybe, I said, hauling her to her feet. But I'll dig as deep as I have to. Back at the station, the interrogation room was stark and unyielding, its fluorescent light harsh against her defiance. She gave her name, Elena Drakov, but refused to say more. Thankfully, the flash drive and the evidence from the warehouse spoke volumes. Financial records, emails, and communications tied the group to several high-profile crimes, with Drakov's fingerprints all over the operation. She wasn't just a hired hand. She was a mastermind. We also recovered a burner phone from her pocket, its messages linking her directly to Victor Lang. When confronted with the evidence, Lang folded like a cheap suit, confessing to everything in exchange for leniency. With his testimony and Drakov in custody, the case against the organization came together. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of the Wellington Hotel once more. The storm had passed, and the air was crisp and clean. Justice had been served, Drakov and Lang were behind bars, and their operation was dismantled piece by piece. But as I looked up at the flickering neon sign, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Drakov had hinted at bigger players, unseen forces pulling the strings. They might be out there, watching, waiting. For now, though, I'd done my part. Edgerton's death hadn't been in vain, and the city was safer for the moment. Sliding my hands into my coat pockets, I turned and walked into the night, ready for whatever came next.